a masterpiece of art that has been missing for over 3 decades. Van Gogh's portrait of Dr. Gachet.
I remember the last times that I saw it. You wish you had known what was going to happen, and you wish you had paid more attention.
Why these things were going to be sold.
And they disappear.
The story of this painting and the fact that it disappeared, it's unbelievable.
I think of this painting as not only a portrait of Dr. Gachet, but a self-portrait of Van Gogh, and because of that, it's a portrait of the modern artist.
We still need to track down where this painting is and who exactly owns the painting.
But you know, of course.
I do know who the owner is, yes. Yeah.
The search for a lost portrait worth millions. A pawn of history.
A painting by Van Gogh has fetched a record price at an auction in New York.
Rolanda Ricardes is in love with the portrait of Dr. Gachet and the story surrounding it. It hangs in her living room in San Diego, California.
I see little things in it when I'm this close to it. Normally I just sit on my on my couch and admire it, but I normally don't stand this close, but you know, I'm seeing little things. I definitely need to get this clean.
Unfortunately, it's not the original, but a rough copy on canvas.
I've never been an art person, ever. I don't make it a habit of going into art museums. I do like our Balboa Park one. I'll go in there occasionally and walk around, but it doesn't touch me the way that my Van Gogh over here does. There's just something always been about this picture. It's just so important to me.
Rolanda has matched the colours of her interior design to the painting. It's been hanging on her living room wall since the late 1990s. Her love of the painting dates back to a fateful meeting with a woman called Sherry.
She had a house out in North Park, and I would go over there occasionally, quite often. And her husband collected art, and she had art all over the place. But I was always drawn towards the Van Gogh. And Sherry and I would sit there and we would be talking, and I was always like this, looking at this Van Gogh. And then Sherry she was getting really close to retirement, and her husband and her were going to divorce. So I was helping her pack up everything, and this Van Gogh was still on her wall, and I was telling her, don't forget this picture, come on, let me help. And she goes, no. She goes, ever since I've known you, she goes, you have loved this picture. She goes, this is my gift to you. At first I thought she was joking. Oh, come on, you know, no. And she goes, Rolanda, she goes, this picture is for you. I want you to have this picture. That's how I got my Van Gogh. Very excited. It's special. Nobody can touch it. My family knows, don't touch it. housekeeper, don't touch it.
Even a copy of Van Gogh's portrait has the power to move people deeply. The fact the original is missing only adds to its mystique. The world over, people are trying to find the lost portrait of Dr. Gachet.
I don't know where the portrait of Dr. Gachet is. I would dearly love to know, but it's a mystery.
How does one go about looking for a painting that's been missing for over 3 decades?
I was a police officer with the city of San Diego for almost 30 years. I would probably start the case. You take it from the first moment you get it all the way to the end.
"8,000 kilometers away from San Diego, art historian Wouter van der Veen is on his way to the small French town of Auvers, north of Paris. This is where it all began.
These days, people visit Auvers-sur-Oise for 3 reasons. Van Gogh, Van Gogh, and Van Gogh. There's no other reason.
To understand why the portrait of Dr. Gachet plays such a key role in art history, and why so many people want to find it, it's worth taking a look at its backstory. Starting with the last journey that Van Gogh ever took.
He arrives in Auvers on May 20th, 1890, and yet he'd been in the asylum in Saint-Rémy for almost a year. And there he'd been diagnosed as having epilepsy and manic depression. He had these episodes where he had hallucinations and seizures, and he was not able to paint.
Any number of factors could have contributed to his mental instability.
But in the spring of 1890, he was getting better, and he wanted to be near Theo, his brother.
I'm convinced he had hope that things could get better.
His brother Theo had written to tell him about an unusual physician.
He understood what it is to be an artist and mental illness.
Dr. Paul Ferdinand Gachet was friends with many of the great Impressionists, including Pissarro, Gauguin, and Renoir.
These artistic geniuses worked right here in the home of Dr. Gachet.
Gachet had a close relationship with these artists and became one of their patrons. But was he able to help Van Gogh fight his demons?
Dr. Gachet was a 61-year-old physician. He had been trained in nervous disorders at Salpêtrière and Bicêtre, the main Paris asylums.
For a start, he was friendly, empathetic. He did a bit of everything. He was interested in everything, but he didn't excel in anything.
He was an aging, out-of-touch physician, and he simply dismissed Van Gogh's very serious psychological problems as simply neuroses. Van Gogh writes, "Dr. Gachet is suffering from illness just as much as I am." And yet only 4 days after he gets to Auvers, he writes to Theo, and I think this is the final word on Dr. Gachet. He writes, "We cannot count on Dr. Gachet at all." And he capitalizes those last 2 words, "at all."
In fact, Van Gogh's mental health appeared stable when he first arrived in Auvers. He painted almost every day and produced many of his most famous works. The portrait of Dr. Gachet would be his last portrait. He wanted it to capture the melancholy the men shared.
So melancholy would mean today sadness and depression.
The painting was created in the garden behind the house, at this very table. Van Gogh set the scene much like a theatre director. He had a clear idea of how he wanted to paint Gachet and what he wanted the portrait to convey. He shared his idea with the physician.
The two took it very seriously. It was an ambitious attempt to capture the abstract idea of melancholy. The flower, the foxglove, symbolized the profession of Dr. Gachet. And the books, what these two cultivated men had in common. Everything was designed to celebrate the meeting of a great artist and a man who played an important role in the art of the time. The
deep blue of his jacket and the background added to the intensity of the work.
I think of this painting as not only a portrait of Dr. Gachet, but a self-portrait of Van Gogh, and because of that, it's a portrait of the modern artist. He compares the role of artist to the role of doctor as diagnosticians of contemporary society. And in fact, when Dr. Gachet really fails to diagnose him, I think of this painting as really an act of self-possession where he then diagnoses the doctor and maybe reflects his own melancholy onto the doctor and creates a painting which he says doesn't just reflect the doctor's depression, but has the heartbroken expression of our time.
Years. I see years. I see struggle. I've always seen that in his eyes.
But just a few weeks after his arrival in Auvergne, Van Gogh's illness caught up with him.
He knew that another crisis was imminent. During his stay in Saint-Remy, he had 4 serious breakdowns in the space of a year. They were becoming more frequent and lasting longer. They were unremitting. He was afraid of them. So he traveled north. But from then on, around mid-July, he sensed a new crisis looming. The melancholy became far too strong, and he could see no way out.
I think there's very scant evidence that he didn't commit suicide.
On July 29, 1890, Van Gogh died in the attic of the Auberge Ravoux in Auvergne as a result of a gunshot wound. Only a few months later, his brother Theo also died. They're buried in the cemetery in Auvergne.
When I visit the graves of Vincent and Theo, I feel respect and humility, but also wonder, because I know that these two brothers filled the world with color. So there is something infinitely positive about the tragedy in Auvergne.
Vincent van Gogh wanted the last portrait he painted, the portrait of Dr. Gachet, to be his legacy. To many, it is his masterpiece.
A masterpiece is a work of art that captures the period in which it was created. And Van Gogh himself says, I would like to paint portraits that appear a century later as apparitions. In other words, haunting images, images that have lived on.
100 years after Van Gogh's arrival in Auvergne, almost to the day, that wish came true.
A painting by Van Gogh has fetched a record price at an auction in New York.
The portrait of Dr. Gachet by Vincent van Gogh is the world's most expensive painting, fetching a record price at an auction at Christie's.
The auction lasted less than 6 minutes. When the hammer finally fell at $82.5 million, cheers broke out.
For you, sir, 75 million.
A Japanese company has paid 135 million Deutschmarks for the portrait of Dr. Gachet, which the Dutch artist completed shortly before his death in 1890.
The world's eyes turned to Van Gogh's masterpiece for the last time. The auction marked a turning point in Cynthia Saltzman's life. She would embark on years of intensive research.
When I started working on it, I realized this painting's history involved major economic and political events in the 20th century. I began researching with the Christie's auction catalog, and I looked at it and I realized it was wrong. The Christie's auction catalog had listed the provenance of the painting, and I realized this must have been one of the paintings that the Nazis had condemned as degenerate art, taken from the German museums. And I found out, yes, that was the case.
But in the early 1990s, the auction houses were unaware of the significance of her research. There was little interest in questions of provenance. At Christie's, the first priority was to make money.
The art market was booming, and then all throughout the 1980s, and the stock market was booming, and that drew a lot of pictures onto the market, and I think they were just focused on getting a price, and so they simply left out the painting's involvement with the Third Reich.
So what was the story? In 1911, the portrait came to the attention of the Städel Museum in Frankfurt. It would play a key role in the fortunes of the museum and its director at the time, Georg Swarzensky.
Georg Swarzensky did a great deal to establish the portrait of Dr. Gachet as a masterpiece. And it was at Drouet's gallery in Paris that Georg Swarzensky saw the painting and bought it for Frankfurt.
This painting, this acquisition, was a key work of modernism, and he brought it to the collection here. Frankfurt was the first public museum to acquire a Van Gogh at the time.
The director paid off the 20,000 francs it cost the museum in installments. He struggled to find financial support. Shortly before the First World War, fierce debate had raged as to whether German museums should exhibit art that had originated in France at all. Swarzensky was one of the first to recognize the brilliance of Van Gogh's work.
The Van Gogh painting was on display in 1933, and that was its undoing. It was exhibited here alongside works of Expressionism. These were ultimately the main target of the Nazis' degenerate art campaign and had to be taken down once they came to power.
The Nazis deemed all art degenerate that did not correspond to their ideology and their racial theories.
Crucially, the Van Gogh painting of Gachet was classified as a clearly degenerate work of art.
Georg Swarzensky was Jewish. Shortly after Hitler seized power, he was dismissed from his position as director of the Städel Museum.
The way he was talked about was despicable. He was described as a product of degeneracy and decay.
Even after Swarzensky's dismissal, the Städel remained in the Nazis' sights. More and more paintings were seized on orders from Berlin.
The painting wasn't taken in the very first sweep of the Frankfurt Museum.
Göring is calling the Städel that they no longer can stall the sale of the painting. They need the money, which I think was basically the whole issue.
It was far more useful to sell the painting abroad for foreign currency. The painting is a prime example of how this so-called degenerate art was exploited for profit.
To this day, all the Städel Museum has left of Van Gogh's portrait is an empty picture frame. Swarzynski bought the painting in this very frame in 1911. It was on display for 25 years before Hitler's deputy, Hermann Göring, instructed an art dealer to sell it in 1937.
He sells it to a German collector who lives in Amsterdam named Franz Koenigs, a banker.
Well, Cynthia Saltzman called me, and she said, "Do you know that your grandfather owned a Van Gogh?" I was overtaken. I had no knowledge, so I didn't know. And then she said she had the information, that she had a note proving that he owned it. Then I asked my father, "Did your father buy Van Goghs?" And he looked at me with sort of a dirty face, like Van Gogh was, you know, like, no, of course not, you know, why would he do that? So the children had no knowledge of this.
Why did the family know nothing? There is evidence in various archives that Franz Koenigs did indeed buy the painting.
That's where things get very vague.
One thing is certain. German-Jewish banker Siegfried Kramarski had the painting brought to New York when he fled Europe and the Nazis. Did Koenig sell it to him, or use it to pay off a debt? There is still no answer to this question. Franz Koenigs died in Cologne in 1941 under obscure circumstances. The portrait of Dr. Gachet remained in the possession of the Kramarski family for more than 50 years. They allowed it to be exhibited in public many times.
I remember the last times that I saw it, and I saw it a number of times at the Metropolitan Museum in the late 1980s. And when I think about these last encounters with the picture, somehow it reminds me of the situation when somebody you know unexpectedly drops dead or dies, and you think back on the last times you saw them and you wish you had known what was going to happen, and you wish you had paid more attention.
And this is in 1990. You know, it's taken from the museum and driven over to Christie's in Midtown Manhattan and sold.
26 million, 27 million, 28 million, 29 million, 30 million. For you, sir, 75 million.
And remember, at this time, Japan, this was peak Japan. Japan's economy was growing. Hollywood was making all sorts of movies about how the Japanese are going to, you know, take over the world. They're so rich. And sure enough, this was the very peak, though. And after that, not so much. But a Japanese businessman bought Dr. Gachet, and it broke all records for a work of art sold at auction.
It was sold to Japanese businessman Roy Saito.
Mr. Saito then got into financial, political, and legal trouble, and he had to sell the painting.
It was completely secret. There were lots of rumors.
And so really nobody knows where this painting is.
Why does the disappearance of such a significant piece of art matter?
The customary progression for most works of modern art, works of great art, like this painting, and this happened to this painting, is to go from private collection to public museum. And this happened to this picture. The progression was reversed, and it's been in private hands ever since.
To whom does it matter? To the art historians, perhaps they'd like to have another look at it. There is another version of this painting, however, in the Musée d'Orsay, which is quite comparable. If they have a sort of a yearning to see Dr. Gachet, they can go and look at that version.
Well, it matters because it's different. Each work of art is unique. And it says, it really expresses Van Gogh. And if you really want to understand him, it expresses this particular moment in Auvers.
Do you know, funnily enough, when I very first started working at Sotheby's, in 1961 in London. I knew absolutely nothing about art or the history of art or anything about it. But my job was to hang pictures on the wall.
At $65,000, $70,000 in the last row, now at 70. At $70,000.
One day when a visitor came in, he challenged me as to why these things were going to be sold into private collections and would never be seen again. They all should be in museums. They all should be available to the public. This is after I'd been like a month in the business, and I listened to this argument with a lot of skepticism then, and it hadn't changed.
$130,000 if it's on the right then, at $130,000. Sold for $1,300,000.
Paintings were made to be sold. They were either commissioned or the artist painted them with the expectation that he would sell them and make money.
I think that it's a wonderful idea. The idea of showing great works of art to the public goes back to the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And the French revolutionaries took the palace of the French king and they took over his collection of art and they put it into the palace, right in the center of Paris, the Louvre. And the Louvre, in theory, all the art there was owned by the public, and it became a great symbol of democracy. And I think it still is today.
An exhibition of work by Norbert Bisky, one of Germany's leading contemporary artists, is opening in New York. Cynthia Zaltzman notices something familiar about one of his recent works.
I always look for poses that reflect an inner life somehow, which is not so easy to find.
A classic pose of melancholy, captured in the 13th century work, The Mourning St. John the Evangelist, or 200 years later, in this work by Albrecht Dürer. And in this Delacroix painting from 1839. The image of a brooding man recurs throughout the history of Western art.
But it's so interesting that somehow it must have been in your mind.
Definitely. I mean, there are a lot of images and paintings in my mind while painting. Also, I think just the wish to paint a painting could just appear in your mind if you already saw a painting. Always a reaction to other paintings.
So do you go to the museum a lot?
A lot. When I was a student, I escaped Berlin. I went to Spain, and Spain was so horribly expensive to me that I spent weeks and weeks in the Prado. So that was a moment that really connected me to the history of painting, because I had no other place to work than the Prado and to look at the painting.
It's one of the main reasons, it seems to me, is for artists to be able to see them in museums. And Van Gogh is a perfect example of this, since he was self-taught, and particularly taught himself at the Louvre.
Yeah, like talking about Van Gogh, I think it's super important that he saw all the masterpieces, not only the historical ones, but also of his time. It's always a combination, I think, between like nature and looking. I mean, looking, of course, like having impressions, but also to look at other people's artwork.
The portrait of Dr. Gachet has not been shown in public since 1990. An investigative reporter with the New York Times, Mike Forsyth, is determined to track it down.
The last person we know who owned the painting is a person from Austria, lived in New York for many, many years, a financier named Wolfgang Flodel. So he owned the painting. He was the person who bought the painting from the Japanese owners, in the late 1990s. And it turns out he ran into financial difficulties as well around the time of the Asian financial crisis, 97, 98.
In 2007, Wolfgang Flodel was involved in a major bank fraud in Austria. The case went to trial, and in court he was asked to disclose details of his finances. The portrait of Dr. Gachet appeared on a list of paintings he had owned.
So we think that maybe Mr. Flottle knows who he sold the painting to. Why wouldn't he? Shouldn't you know? We did find an address for Mr. Flottle. This is a particularly wealthy part of Park Avenue. You know, in these blocks, you know, are some of the titans of industry and billionaires. So we went to this building, and the plan was to give him a call first and see if he was home, and perhaps he would take an interview. Okay, I'm calling now. Not in service. I'm going to call one of the cell phone numbers here.
New York gallery owner David Nash knows Wolfgang Fluttel well. In the late 1990s, he helped him sell the portrait of Dr. Gachet.
He was amassing a really fantastic collection. He'd made some brilliant investments and made a lot of money. And he spent a lot of it buying paintings. He owned wonderful, wonderful paintings.
Was Fluttel a passionate art collector, or simply looking to build a fortune?
I don't know where he had this particular painting. I think it remained in a warehouse. He owned a painting, another famous painting by Picasso called Le Rêve. And when he got into financial difficulties, he asked me to sell it for him. And I did. I sold it to Steve Wynn. When Steve Wynn came to look at the painting, it was shipped over from Zurich. It was told to me that the painting hadn't been out of its crate since the auction 10 years before. It had stayed in its crate in the warehouse in Zurich, and Flottel hadn't actually hung it anywhere.
So I called. Oh, yes, hi, is this Mr. Flottel? And to my surprise, he answered the phone. Listen, I am working on a story about the portrait of Dr. Gachet, the Van Gogh painting that you owned. And I would really, really like to talk to you just about the painting and where it might be, you know, who you sold it to. I know it's been some time. Yeah? Yes.
When Wolfgang Fluttel sold the portrait of Dr. Gachet, the transaction was handled by the auction house Sotheby's, this time without the involvement of David Nash.
I think what had happened was that Sotheby's had lent Mr. Flottel quite a lot of money, and they had taken several paintings as collateral. And I think that Dr. Gachet was one of them. And so when he needed to sell it, he didn't really have much in the way of options to choose from, and Sotheby's handled the sale for him to get their money back.
Is there any way you could tell me how much the painting was sold for to this collector? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I really appreciate you talking to me. Okay. I hope so. I hope so. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Bye. He's not here. So he doesn't live here anymore. And he was very polite. But he said he was a very private person, does not give interviews, wouldn't say where he was right now. He said that he doesn't even know the identity of the owner, the new owner, that it was all done through Sotheby's and through a lawyer, and he was told it was a known collector. I was quite surprised that he had no idea who owned it. Maybe he does and he wasn't telling me. And so he said he was still bound by non-disclosure agreements to even tell me how much he sold the painting for. So the mystery remains.
But you know, of course.
I do know who the owner is, yes. Yeah.
Well, why is it so secretive?
I don't know the answer.
It says so much about the secrecy of the art world, and these dealers and auction houses, they make money off secrecy, right? This is how they make their money. And it's really only journalists who aren't in it for the money. We want to know where these paintings are. We want to know the stories of these paintings, and we want people to be able to enjoy them, and see them in museums. So we still need to track down, where this painting is and who exactly owns the painting.
I had always heard that there was a possibility of the original, the one missing, in Switzerland, in some mansion somewhere.
According to rumours circulating within the art world, the painting now belongs to a family based here on Lake Lugano in Switzerland. Multi-billionaires who made a fortune in the food industry.
How many people say they know where something is, but you can't quote them, and do they have firsthand knowledge? Or did they just hear from somebody who heard from somebody? That's usually the case. And the more people who might say, well, we are sure it's this family, the more people are saying this. As long as they're not all talking to each other and it's kind of a circular thing, then the more confidence you have. But it is extremely difficult, especially when confronted, as we suspect, by a very profoundly secretive family who we suspect owns this painting.
In response to queries, the family denies that it owns the painting. One can only speculate as to why the portrait's owners want to remain anonymous. Van Gogh wanted his works to express their time and live on. The portrait of Dr. Gachet does more than that. It also says something unique about the present.
Especially what's been happening to the painting in the last 35 years is very much an expression of our time, because a very wealthy person bought it. These wealthy people can buy up things that were in museums and they disappear and they don't share them with the world. It's just masked in this secrecy and this whole infrastructure of people who want to keep it secret. And it's not just the art dealers, but it's the museum curators as well, because they don't want to upset people, by revealing where these things are, because they want to keep, theoretically getting paintings loaned to them to display. So there's this whole infrastructure of secrecy.
Rolanda Ricardez's youngest son Alex is visiting from Los Angeles. He's a photographer. He grew up with a painting on the wall of the living room.
There's always a conversation starter anytime you had somebody over.
Yeah, it's the first thing everybody notices.
Oh, it's the first thing you tell people about.
Well, yes, that too. No, people notice the Van Gogh. People notice because it's beautiful. So they always talk about it. And of course, I let everybody know that it's the missing Van Gogh, and
someday you'll be rich.
Someday. Not me, my family.
Yeah.
My family will benefit. Right?
Yeah. I'm sure that $15 will go far for us.
Oh, it's gone up to $15?
Well.
These are not cats. My son's joke about how they'll get about $5 at a garage sale. I go, yeah, but someday, you know, if we find out, that's the missing Van Gogh.
Just make sure you leave it to me and not my brother.
Well, I won't be around, so it's up to you guys.
Disco. Stop.
We all have our dreams. We all think what we want to think, and I know in my heart of hearts it's not the original, but it might as well be. In my heart, I don't know, it's just my picture, it's my Van Gogh. I hope someday they share it, if they have it, because something like this needs to be seen, you know.
It will appear again, I'm quite convinced, but maybe not during my lifetime or in the next 10 years. I'm not sure.
We don't know. The world is so changing so much today. The morals are changing, the attitudes, everything is changing. So you don't know. So I have no idea. I can't look in the future.
Je pense que ça va prendre encore un peu de temps.
It will take time. I reckon another 20 years.
Pour le moment. Mais
but where there's smoke, there's fire. We'll find it again somewhere.
Et on le retrouvera.
I would pay, I think, any amount to go see it. If somebody were to say, okay, here's the original. This one, not one of other Van Goghs, but this one, because of what this means to me. I know I wouldn't be able to get this close, but can you imagine standing in front of the original? I'd probably cry. I don't know. Not probably, I would cry. My goodness, yes. Yes.